approach that we're taking here is to ensure that we do our level best to keep these hearings on schedule. We have 2 days, and so as a result of that, we've made a fairly deliberate decision to try. Each of you has counsel, and we've made a decision to try to permit your counsel as much time as we can within the confines of the time available to ask you questions in addition to mine. As a result, my approach today will be to go to some relatively big questions and to take that approach. I'll do my best as well to permit each of you to address the different questions that I have. I will start with one, if you will, a big question, which is this. And perhaps I'll start, Ms. Stewart, with you, and we can move through the panel this way, and I'll see if I shuffle the batting order, so to speak, as we go. So, Ms. Stewart, if I'll begin with you. Can DFO successfully both promote and regulate the aquaculture industry? Can it do both things?
I don't believe that's possible, and I believe that DFO has a primary constitutional mandate to protect ocean ecosystem health and wild stocks, and they have a political mandate in recent years to be a promoter and an advocate for the aquaculture industry, the development and expansion of such. And if you look at the patterns of behavior from marketing, meeting with retailers, promoting aquaculture at seafood expositions such as the Boston Seafood Show, at their promotional materials, at the granting programs such as AMAP, they're very much acting on behalf of the promotion and development of the aquaculture industry. I think that the department needs to fulfill its primary obligation to Canadians and ensure that there are healthy wild salmon stocks and healthy, fully functioning marine ecosystems for our future. And those two are in conflict with one another, given the weight of scientific evidence, given the track record of the industry globally, and the continual evolution and exposure of the problems that are associated with open net cages. DFO cannot be a rigorous and effective enforcing mechanism at the same time as there being an advocate and a promoter of the industry.
In your view, what should happen? If there's a conflict that you've described, what is the solution? Is there a solution to that conflict?
I think those two mandates have to be separated. I personally don't have a problem with Industry and Trade Canada or other departments supporting Canadian businesses, although I would certainly prefer to see them supporting much more responsible and ecologically sustainable businesses. So open net cages would still not be on that list, but I understand the mandate of the government to support Canadian industry. But I believe that the two mandates are in fundamental conflict and they have to be extricated. So if DFO is constitutionally mandated to be the enforcing agency, then the promotional responsibility should be shifted to another department. I'm not in a position to say what department. Maybe it's Agriculture Canada, maybe it's Industry and Trade, but we have to extract that responsibility from DFO in order to allow them to effectively perform their primary mandate.
Ms. Morton, your name is atop a case that we all know about. It's sometimes referred to as the Morton decision or the Hinkson decision, but it's your name on the style of cause. The case states, I believe it was released in February 2009 and really changed an important part of the regulatory regime, putting the DFO largely in the driver's seat vis-a-vis the regulation of finfish aquaculture. I wonder if you could address the question about conflicts, but also offer your views on whether the change in the federal role, so to speak, resulting from that court decision aggravates or mitigates any conflict that exists.
Okay, yeah, great questions. Just so people know, the reason I came into conflict with this industry was as a biologist in the Broughton Archipelago, as you said, studying whales. And so the first experience that myself and my community and the First Nations community around us had with the industry had to do with siting. And we were asked to tell DFO in the province where we did not want salmon farms. And they produced a map and they made red zones, and they said they would not even accept an application for a finfish farm to those sites. But within a few months, there was more sites, more farms in those red zones than anywhere else. So there were DFO officers involved at that level, and a lot of them quit over that because they did not feel good about what was happening. So from my perspective, from that point forward, when push has come to shove about whether the priority is going to be given to the wild fish or to the industry, it has always gone to the industry. Now, the industry might have a different perspective on that, but I'm on the grounds, and I'm looking at the fish. The reason I went to Gregory McDade and challenged the provincial regulation of salmon farms is because when this was done in the late 1980s, when salmon farms were given to the province, it was because it was a constitutional problem to be regulating a fishery in the oceans, because that is a federal jurisdiction. And there was work done by Bruce Wildsmith, a lawyer, was tasked by the government to give them a decision on whether or not it was constitutional for the government of Canada to have salmon farms in the ocean. And he said in his decision, you're going to have to change the Constitution of Canada to be able to privatize the spaces and pretend to own fish in the ocean. But what happened was, instead of going to the level of changing the Constitution of Canada, they slid the whole thing to the province. And at that moment, they were regulated as farms. And the province knew how to regulate farms. Everybody knows the rules about that. But what happened was nobody was responsible for the impact of the farms to the wild salmon. So I didn't make that move because I thought the federal government would be better. I had a long history of problems with the federal government accepting that there were problems with the industry. I did it because what was happening was so wrong. And I was hoping that in the shakeup that occurred after, that it would resettle in a more logical and beneficial manner to Canada. But what I see is a retraction of even where we were with the province, where there are no regulations against infecting wild salmon with disease from farms. There's no regulations about the release of pathogens. The whole issue of deleterious substances seems to have been removed. Everything seems to now be up to not the province anymore, but just the fish farmers themselves. So, no, I think it's potentially worse. As a biologist, as someone who's looked at this from inside and out, I don't see how the industry can exist legally or biologically in the ocean. So I really don't think I don't think anyone can regulate this industry correctly in the ocean.
Vis-a-vis a conflict in the DFO's involvement in aquaculture, I take from, you didn't quite say it this way, but I take from your answer that you would identify a conflict. Do you see there being any solution to it, or would you suggest an even further solution of simply putting an end to the aquaculture as practiced on the coast now?
Well, when I was living in Echo Bay, my neighbor was the DFO patrol officer, and he got rumors that herring had spawned on the chains of a net called the Birdwood Farm. And he was physically restrained from going. His job was to enumerate herring spawn, but he was physically restrained by other DFO officers from going there. He tried to get onto the First Nations patrol boat, but also was restrained. They had the argument in boats out in front of my house. So the first thing that needs to happen is officers need to be able to go onto these facilities without an invitation, simply board them as they do all vessels. But because these operations break fundamental biological laws, I don't even see a way forward with DFO managing it at all.
Mr. Backman, the initial question had to do with whether there is a conflict for the Department of Fisheries and Oceans in both promoting and regulating the aquaculture industry. Do you have views on that?
Yeah, I think that it appears to be a conflict to the initial observer when you've got an agency that both has to appear to promote and to regulate an industry. But in our modern world, in the modern system of governance, it's quite common that you have a agency that actually plays dual roles. They have to, on the one hand, understand the fishery or the industry that they're dealing with, and on the other hand, they have to enforce the regulations that apply to it. An example of that would be operational health and safety officers working within a particular industry where they're promoting the compliance of with operational health and safety. At the same time, they're bringing forward the regulations. So we have a situation in our industry where we are now a fishery, and when you look at other fisheries that the DFO manages, they understand the fishery, they work with the fishery to try and promote the most effective means of undertaking that activity, but on the other hand, they very clearly lay out what the regulatory requirements are, and the regulatory requirements are also subject to change. They're being adapted, and we see that happening in the last few months under the new regime as well. We're moving forward. We're seeing changes and improvements and new aspects to the regulation under the DFO. So really it's a movement toward a collaborative effort, if you would, but in the main, it's the DFO has their role to play. They learn as they go, as a brand new approach to us. They're learning as they go to some degree about our industry, but they're clearly demonstrating what it is that they expect us to be doing.
Ms. Parker, would you care to offer your sense of the industry view on whether there's a conflict for the department that arises? Anything to add to what Mr. Backman said?
Well, if you accept the premise that aquaculture is a fishery, then this approach to management is consistent with how other commercial fisheries are managed in Canada. And historically, DFO has both promoted Canadian capture fisheries while at the same time making sure they meet national and international regulation. I think one of the things to realize that this is, I think, more visible now than it was previously because we have this global trend towards eco-certification and also export certification to international markets. So what you see is the regulator taking a stronger role in educating markets on the role the regulator has. So what, am I too quiet? I'm sorry. So what you have is the same activities that have been taking place in a more visible way. Product going to Europe right now has to be certified by DFO from a regulatory perspective, what the management structure is, what the frameworks are that are being met and enforced. And I think there is a slight benefit to enforcement when DFO is both is now our lead regulator in that they have access to all of our information. And so before a CMP officer ever sets foot on a site, he has access to every bit of information. So the investigation can almost happen before the site visit.
In the course of asking the first question around conflicts, and it's not a problem, but I think a number of you went into a discussion about the merits of how DFO is doing. So let me simply move into asking you about that. And Ms. Morton, you started to offer some thoughts. I think you touched on the Section 35 HAD, harmful alteration and I'm sorry, I won't even try and give you it off the top of my head. But the approach that the DFO has taken, which as I understand would subsume those considerations into the conditions of license. What I'll do here is ask again for your comments, panel members, on what the department is doing well, where the department's approach to regulation and management of aquaculture falls short, and if you have particular suggestions or recommendations or improvements that you'd like to speak about, that's helpful. Certainly within that question, if you'd care to address siting and licensing, consultation with First Nations, local communities, stakeholders, or other components of the management regime, which is, I appreciate, a very broad description, but would include the Section 35 HAD question, habitat compensation, the proposed IMAPs, integrated management of aquaculture plans, as well as the question about public access to information for finfish aquaculture. So it is a broad question, but Ms. Morton, if I could start with you and ask for your views on what's, if you have anything on the good side of the ledger that's gone well with the DFO's management, and what has not gone well, and where you see a need for improvement.
The last 2 weeks of sitting in these hearings have confirmed for me the enormity of the problem. We have a scientist who says the majority of Fraser sockeye appear to be weakened and dying of what she truly thinks is a virus. Now, for Dr. Miller, this virus being associated with salmon farms has clearly been bad for her career. Her husband is in the aquaculture industry. It's been bad for her personally. And yet, she's determined to get to the bottom of this, and DFO has withdrawn her funding to work on sockeye. And I think that that, for me, so clearly represents the issues that I've had. When I began writing letters to DFO in 1989 about sighting, I said to them, don't put them on the major migration routes. Maybe the Broughton is a one corporation archipelago because the companies kept saying they needed a cluster of 5 farms. Have an ace in the hole, leave a migration route opening, and just in case this is a big problem. And they refused. And today, I see part of the problem. I've read so much of what's in Ringtail, and the problem is everybody's in their trenches. I don't think anyone in senior management in DFO knows what Dr. Marty so carefully put into his disease records. I've phoned a couple of them and asked them, without revealing what I know, have you read the disease records of the salmon farm? No. So they've been saying this is sustainable and not a problem without actually knowing what's going on. And now we have a scientist who could illuminate it. The other thing that DFO has not done, but there are people within the department who want to do it, is let's just follow the fish. With telemetry, genomic profiling, the ability to test the plankton, we could know where these fish are running into a bottleneck. For 18 years, hundreds of thousands of sockeye have been dying before they spawned on the banks of the Fraser River. And when I read through Ringtail, there's a document I've put together, and it's been marked for identification, where I quote a lot of the scientists talking about it. Dr. Christine McWilliams saying everything but the kitchen sink is in these fish. Other people saying we've got 11 gill arches, and we lost the entire Nadina Fraser sockeye. All I have is 11 gill arches, and they're rotten. I can't tell what happened to these fish. DFO didn't support these pathologists who were going into the field and trying to figure it out. And then Miller comes along with a new method, cuts through the noise of all the symptoms, and her data very uncomfortably said retrovirus, virus, cancer. Today, I'm in a confused state about that. We had Dr. Kent, who was ex-head of science for the Pacific Biological Station, saying he now doesn't believe his 10 years of work. There are no brain tumors. We have Mark Shepard, who is diagnosing the farms on a farm level. He's saying salmon leukemia, marine anemia doesn't exist. Dr. Gary Marty has painstakingly been recording their symptoms, and I thank Dr. Marty for that, because when he came online, we finally were able to see he organized the data in a way that even I could understand it. And then we had Dr. Saxita on the stand yesterday saying, oh yeah, marine anemia exists. Okay, so guys, does it exist or does it not? Are there brain tumors in the majority of Fraser sockeye or not? DFO needs to figure that out, I think, before we go one step farther. Where is this coming from? And this commission is about not only what's happened to the Fraser sockeye in 2009, but the whole pattern. And so whatever we're looking for has to fit that whole pattern. So I would say I can't give DFO any credit for anything at this point until we work that one out.
To pick up on a point you made, would you say that the DFO needs to do more to support its scientists?
They need to free their scientists. We need the Fisheries Research Board type of style back again. I've talked to people like Gordon Hartman, who he resigned from DFO over the Nechako. They wanted to take the water out of the Nechako River and divert it to the Alcan plant. And DFO's line was basically the salmon will be fine without water in their river. And this man just quit because he could not toe that line. So the scientists, yes, need to be released from the political body. All the correspondence we've seen where Miller can't talk to the press, even to her own colleagues. She was prevented from telling the Pacific Salmon Commission when she thought this virus began, because uncomfortably it began at the moment the salmon farms were put in the narrowest passages of the Fraser sockeye migration route. That's just plain wrong.
Mr. Backman, I'll move to you next, and then we'll proceed through and to Ms. Parker and then Ms. Stewart. Could you comment, please, on the strengths and weaknesses of the department's regulation and management of aquaculture, and if you see room for improvement or changes, what those might be?
Be happy to. The new situation that we're under is actually more efficient than previous. In the previous to December 2010, we had several agencies in the provincial government plus the DFO who were responsible for managing and regulating this industry. This led to some inefficiencies with communication between departments, time delays. Certainly there was an inability to engage with DFO science because the province had to talk to them about an issue that was becoming apparent and then engage them in their budgeting process and that sort of thing. What we have now under the Pacific Aquaculture Regulation is everything under one house, so to speak. And we're already seeing some benefits there in terms of being able to have more efficient discussions and responses back and forth between the agencies. I think another aspect that should be brought up too is the level of consultation, both with First Nations and with industry groups and those that are interested in the industry. We see through the developing IMAP process a opportunity to expand the level of consultation that exists already. And it has been in the past associated with change, primarily consultation around farm applications or consultation around major amendments. And so the IMAP process, one of the many aspects, it promises to bring ongoing and continual stakeholder input and information gathering. There's many improvements that we see. One of the ones we're grappling with right now is the public reporting aspect, and we've had already some release of information captured at the farms this year, and it's a wide variety of information. There's at least 10 new reporting elements under the Pacific Aquaculture Regulation that weren't there before, and it's caused quite a bit of activity and resource to be placed this way into reporting by the companies. Just exactly how that information will be used and what the effects will be is going to be worked out as we go forward, but it's certainly supporting transparency and sharing of information, supporting an openness that hasn't been there in the past.
Maybe I can simply pick up on one point when you described this, the information that's being made available. I don't know if you were present for it or know about it. We had some evidence recently from, I think, Trevor Swerdfager answering questions and took us to some exerted pages from the DFO's website. But is that part of what you're describing in terms of the making information available to the public? Ms. Grant's passed me a note that says Exhibit 1597. Perhaps, Mr. Lunn, you can put that on screen if you're able. But is that what you're describing?
I am, yes. And I'll quickly summarize the difference. In the past, under the provincial regulation, there was certainly information captured and reported to government on a regular basis, and it usually was discussed back and forth between the company and the agency. Then there would be a reporting out by the government on an annual basis, and sometimes it was a year delayed. I assume that the reporting out will still happen in terms of government responses to the information, but now what we see, and on the web page here is a good example of what's actually happening on the farms in terms of issues related to bycatch, that is animals that fish that that we don't have a license for that move in through the pens, for example. Information related to whatever escapes may occur from salmon farms. It's right there for everyone to see. And we welcome this in the industry because it's really demonstrating two things. One, a lot of the concerns are much lower than maybe are popularly thought. The other thing is it allows us to demonstrate a trend over time of continuing to reduce these concerns.
Ms. Parker, the question about strengths and weaknesses and areas for improvement in the DFO's management and approach to aquaculture. Comments on that?
Yeah. I'd like to follow up on something that Claire said when he mentioned greater access to science. And I think it's also greater emphasis on science. Science informs management approaches, it informs decision making, and it's applied throughout the process from the application review stage to the actual licensing and then operationally afterwards. And I think that that closer connection to science will help improve the environmental performance of the industry. And I also think that it'll help align more efficiently where both government and industry resources are allocated, so that we're focusing on the right kinds of impacts or effects and the right kinds of issues. And I think that will only be helpful. I also feel that the integrated management of aquaculture plan process, I think it could be a great benefit. I think it'll have more regular structured consultation. I think it'll be a broader way to capture community and stakeholder input. Right now, when consultation happens, it happens on an ad hoc basis, site by site. It doesn't capture impacts or effects to an area. It doesn't support broad-based area planning. And all of these things, I think, would be better for the relationship with industry and communities, and also, I think, gives us a better, stronger platform for environmental management.
Ms. Stewart, do you have further comments, and if you'd care to pick up on the development of IMAPs and whether that's a process that instills optimism for you?
Optimism, that's an unfamiliar term. But yeah, I do actually have several comments. I think for starters, I do want to acknowledge that there are a lot of good people and very well-intentioned and very dedicated people in DFO. And they're constrained by the political mandate. They're constrained from doing the job they would like to do by their desire to actually stay with the department and have a career. I think that we have a real problem with the new Pacific aquaculture regulations now that DFO is assuming control of regulating the industry. They're abandoning the SIA process. They're assuring us that HADs will be captured within the licenses, and yet we see no mechanism for compensation around habitat loss. I'm very concerned about the black hole around deleterious substances and the pest and pathogen regulation. Initially, we were given a copy of a regulatory discussion document because pest and pathogen treatment was omitted from the Pacific aquaculture regulations. Trevor and his associates started with a discussion document around new regulations. Then there was some discussion around fast-tracking that because there were, in effect, the industry was being exempt from Section 36 of the Fisheries Act by the absence of requirements under the PARs. But then recently we've heard Mr. Swerdfager testify that that's kind of on hold and there's some jurisdictional confusion with Environment Canada. And in a conversation I had with Andy Thompson, I said, well, so who is controlling this? The farms are administering parasiticide treatments for sea lice infestations. On the East Coast, they're using bath treatments such as deltamethrin, which is highly toxic. Where does this fall on the Pacific Coast within that regulatory regime? And Mr. Thompson admitted it was a black hole, that they're simply not covered at the moment. There is no regulatory process in place that restricts, limits, or controls the administration of those toxic substances in the marine environment. I'm sure the department's intention is to resolve the jurisdictional dispute and come up with some regulation, but it's a real concern to me that they are currently, in effect, exempt. It's a concern that we're hearing there's no ticketable offenses. I think it's very difficult for a conservation and protection officer to, if he sees a violation that perhaps isn't an end-of-the-world violation, but is one that should be duly noted and the company should be admonished for, he doesn't have the option of writing a ticket. Right now, the only option available is to lay charges. That's followed by letters. I think that there's some big gaps in the regulatory regime right now. I think DFO has misaligned its priorities around spending money. They've invested $70 million in the 5-year program under AMAP, and a lot of that money goes directly to the industry to support programs that, in many cases, should be the industry's problem to resolve. There's been a real priority focus on the expansion of the aquaculture industry, the NASAPI program, the National Aquaculture Strategic I can't even remember what all the acronyms stand for, but it's
Well,
basically.
I'll give you another one, which is the PPR, but the Policy and Practice
Yeah.
Report does indeed describe the NASAPI.
It does describe NASAPI, and
process.
I'm very familiar with the NASAPI, and the primary agenda there is the industry's expansion. It talks about the market potential. It talks about the growth potential being underutilized. They funded Bob Devlin's research into transgenic fish for 20 years. That is not to benefit wild fish. That is, another sort of hidden subsidy to the aquaculture industry. I think the department has to acknowledge the weight of scientific evidence, and they do so outside of our borders. So within Canada, if you look at DFO's website, there's a lot of denial around the problems of sea lice and transfer of pathogens and disease. But then internationally, in forums like NASCO, the North Atlantic Salmon Conservation Organization, when Canada writes a report, they acknowledge within that report that lice impact wild fish. And so they know that internationally they would not be able to maintain credibility of their science if they failed to acknowledge the weight of scientific evidence, but they're still trying to deny it domestically. I agree with Alex. I think that the department needs to free up the scientists. It needs to prioritize the funding of science rather than the funding of industry promotion and subsidizing the industry. They need to publish DFO science. There's an awful lot of science done that never sees the light of day. And I think I see the industry is nodding in agreement, and I think it would be to everyone's
I'm not inclined to
benefit.
interrupt if I can avoid it, but
Sure.
there's maybe the only chance we have all of you nodding. Do all panel members agree with that last point? I saw you all nod, but perhaps
Yes.
you can stay on the record so we reflected. Do you all agree with the point about DFO publishing science?
Yes.
All right, we all agree. I think that the point was made around more transparency in the industry, and certainly that's something that CAR and Living Oceans have been pushing for a very long time. DFO has been rather slow to get information up on the website, and we'll see how much comes out and how quickly. But much of it, I think we have to remember, is going to be reliant on industry self-reporting, and that point was raised by one of the witnesses earlier this week. And I think that conservation and protection is seriously underfunded and under-resourced and needs an awful lot more capacity, and that DFO should look at market trends, look at the weight of evidence, and invest in innovation and solutions such as closed containment.
Mr. Backman, I was going to move to you for the next question. I saw that you'd indicated you wished to pick up on a point I believe that Ms. Stewart made, so perhaps I can simply invite you to offer the further comments you have, but in the course of that as well, if you're able to address the next topic I have, which is the topic of fish health. Mr. Lunn, if you could put number 9 from our list, which is Exhibit 1611, which is a proposed approach to fish health from the DFO. I won't go into it in much detail, but we've had some evidence about this. This approach describes efforts to keep farmed fish healthy, to monitor their health, respond to fish health events, record and report fish health data, and as well employ fish health management plans. From your perspective, is the DFO approach to fish health the right one? Do you see room for improvements with that approach?
Before I answer that, I just wanted to return to the comment. It was mentioned that there's been an abandonment of the Canadian Environmental Assessment of farms, and I think that that's incorrect, in that what we haven't had is any applications for farms as a result of the changeover from the provincial to the federal jurisdiction. There's been a very long delay. There hasn't been any applications come forward, but I think the Canadian Environmental Assessment rescreening of applications is still very much alive. I think it's still very much in place, and I think that compensatory habitat is still very much an element of that as we go forward. But to your question on the approach to fish health by the Pacific Aquaculture Regulation draft here, it looks from the familiarity that I have at this point like a very good start, a very good approach by the federal agencies. And I think what it will do is, has been brought up previously by other panels, specifically the veterinarian panel, it will bring another level of familiarity and audit to the work that we're already doing on our farm sites. I think Dr. Shepard, when he was on a panel recently, spent some time explaining the degree of testing that goes on at a farm site level. He characterized it as day in, day out, 365 days a year, where the farm staff observe, report, take records, they do necropsies on recently dead animals, they keep ongoing strong database within the company. This is working with the veterinarial staff. They send two independent labs, they send tissue samples for bacteriology or virology work. This is ongoing all the time, and so what I see happening here is that the provincial or the federal government will then become more aware. They will have a parallel program which will have more, perhaps more resources than was previously under the provincial government, and they will be able to more closely monitor this kind of work that's already ongoing and be able to validate and also to offer improvements where they see improvements can be made. With the whole program identified in order to reduce the already low incidence of fish health events that are happening on our farm sites. So with the good husbandry, with the vaccination of all of the fish before they go into the ocean, the number of fish health events on salmon farms today is very, very low. And the program like this can only partner with industry and develop situations where we can actually reduce the incidence of reportable events even further than they are today.
Ms. Parker, from your point of view, any further points to make vis-a-vis, or do you care to offer a view with respect to the approach to fish health?
Yes. And before I start, I'd just like to...
And perhaps I'll just ask all witnesses as we do this, if you're able to toggle the mic so it's right in front of you, that's helpful. Thanks.
Sorry. Correct something I said earlier, if that's okay. There was no regulation that restricts the application of... In fact, the Animals Act, FDA, and the Pest Control Products Act all restrict the application and use of lice treatments. So.
All right.
Okay, so one of the this is a very well, it's an approach document, not necessarily a policy or a very structured document. But what it does do is it sets the stage for a hazard access critical control point approach to managing fish health. So it's consistent with FAO guidelines, and it sets the stage for sort of hazard-based or risk-based management of fish health, so that there are controls from brood stock and egg take all the way through to disease monitoring on farm, and actually sets the stage for management actions should there be a problem when the fish are in the ocean. So it takes a multi-stage approach, and it's consistent with both OIE, but particularly with the FAO HACCP approach to health management.
Before I forget to do this, I'll just put on record that the document on screen, Exhibit 1611, has a big watermark. It's more clear on the big screen, indicating it's a draft document. I think that fits with what we heard about it in evidence. So this is just to clarify, this is a draft as opposed to a final policy or approach document. If I might turn, please, Ms. Stewart, with the same question about fish health. If you'd like to pick up on the point that Ms. Parker made, that's fine. Thank you.
Thanks. I will. And I agree with Mia that there are controls in terms of what the farmers can administer and the impact on their fish stocks, what is shipped into the marketplace, residues in product being delivered to the marketplace. But that's all about their stocks. When I talk about the administration of pest and pathogen treatments in our marine environment, I'm talking about deleterious substances going into our receiving waters, into the commons. I'm talking about the impact on non-farm species, on wild salmon and on other species in that surrounding environment. The same thing applies to the use of slice, right? Slice is authorized by Health Canada for use on the farms, amamectin benzoate. When CAR tried to obtain the The information on which that decision was based, Health Canada told our representative who contacted them that it was proprietary. The information was, their decision was based on studies that were conducted by the manufacturer of Slice. And they were unable to provide us with the studies that informed their decision because they were conducted by the manufacturer. That does not give me a great deal of comfort that the health of our marine ecosystems are being protected. Sea lice are a crustacean. What's the impact of slice on other crustaceans? Dr. John Volpe at the University of Victoria was trying to do a study on that and asked the farms to give him notice when they were going to be administering slice in their feed to their farm fish, and they declined to do that. So he was reduced to taking random samples based on a guesstimate of when they might or might not be treating in order to try and do some assessment. So I have no doubt that the farms are committed to doing their best to maintain the health of their fish. My concern is the health of our fish, the health of the wild ecosystem, and that's where I think we're falling down on the job. I think DFO needs to undertake an awful lot more science analyzing what is happening outside the farm environment. For example, there's a study that was undertaken by Dr. Orr and others around that found elevated levels of mercury in rockfish in close proximity to fish farms. What is DFO doing about that? Where's the analysis on those impacts? That's where I think the department needs to take its enforcement responsibilities and its environmental responsibilities much more seriously.
Ms. Morton, I'm approaching the end of my own time allocation to myself, but to close the circle, I wonder if I could ask you to please respond to this question about the approach taken to fish health.
I would agree with Catherine. It is about their fish. The new regulations are about their fish. Like I said, it is not unlawful to expose or even infect wild fish with pathogens. And there's a lot of information in the disease records that speak to the potential for exotic pathogens having arrived, and I don't see that was captured anywhere. I was certainly not alerted. I don't hear anybody talking about it. I don't see the type of testing done to certify these farms as being free of those diseases. So I think it is the number one concern is disease transfer from salmon farms, and a lot of that is based on bad sighting.
Panel members, thank you very much for your time with my questions. I'm only the first of a series of lawyers. I will just simply remind you before I sit down that as you answer questions, if you could please direct your answer to the commissioner or to the lawyer asking the question as opposed to the other panel members. That's very helpful for our process. I'll ask next counsel for the BC Salmon Farmers Association, Mr. Commissioner, with a 90-minute allocation.